The smell of lilies filled the old chapel that afternoon, mixed with the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax. I moved between the pews, checking every ribbon and every flower arrangement, pretending my hands weren't trembling. The choir rehearsed softly in the background, their voices echoing against the high ceilings of St. Helena Church in downtown Seattle. It was supposed to be a perfect day, the start of something I had built with patience, not luck. Ethan came in through the side door holding a paper cup of coffee, and that half-smile of his. "Everything looks perfect," he said, handing me the cup. "You're just nervous because you care too much." I smiled, or tried to. My phone vibrated inside my clutch. The screen lit up Dad. For a second, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let it ring out, but old habits die hard. I picked up. "Hi, Dad," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "I was just checking if your flight from Portland." His voice cut me off sharp and dry. "We're not coming, Clara. We don't have time for your wedding." I blinked, thinking I'd misheard. "What?" Silence. Then his tone turned almost impatient, like he was explaining something obvious. "Your sister got invited to Paris Fashion Week. It's a real opportunity, the kind that matters. We're flying out tonight." "But I sent the invitations 6 months ago." I whispered. "You knew the date." Don't make this dramatic," he said. "You'll understand when you have kids. Sometimes priorities are just different." I could hear Mom in the background. "Honey," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "Don't be upset. We'll watch the livestream, okay?" "It's the same thing. The same thing." I repeated, my throat closing. I stared at the invitation lying on the table. Cream paper gold lettering the words, "Mr. and Mrs. Robert Bennett request the honor of your presence." Words that now felt like a joke. "I really wanted you there," I said softly. "You've always wanted too much, Clara," my father replied. And the line went dead. I stood there holding the phone until the screen dimmed, until Ethan's voice brought me back. "Hey, what's wrong?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the flowers, at the perfect symmetry of everything around me, the illusion of control that had taken months to build. He came closer, brushing his thumb across my hand. "Talk to me." "They're not coming," I said flatly. "They're going to Paris with Sophie." His face tightened. "You're kidding." "No. Apparently that's where real opportunities are." I tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. He exhaled slowly, trying to find words that would fix what couldn't be fixed. "I'm sorry, Clara. Don't be," I said, stepping back. "This is just them." I walked toward the mirror near the vestry, the one the bridesmaids had used earlier to fix their hair. My reflection looked composed, hair pinned perfectly, veil falling just right. I didn't look like someone who had just been told she wasn't worth the flight. My voice in the mirror sounded steadier than I felt. "They've done this before," I said quietly. "Birthdays, graduations, promotions, always some reason not to show up. I should be used to it." Ethan took a step closer. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt." I met his eyes in the mirror. "If I don't pretend, I won't make it down the aisle." He sighed, but didn't push. "Whatever you need, I'm here." I nodded and turned back to the pews. The late sunlight spilled through the stained glass painting the floor with patches of red and blue. The choir had stopped singing. Only the echo of their last note lingered. I picked up one of the programs from the front pew and traced my name with my thumb. Clara and Ethan, May 17th, 2024. I'd imagined my father walking me down the aisle, his hand steady on mine, the quiet pride I'd always wanted to see in his face. But that image had never been real. It was just something I kept hoping might one day exist. Clara, Ethan said softly. "Look at me. I did. This day is about us, not them." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to let his words erase years of silence, missed calls, forgotten birthdays. But a part of me knew, no matter how loud the choir sang tomorrow, I'd still hear the echo of his voice saying, "We don't have time." I set down the program, straightened my veil, and looked at my reflection one last time. "They'll see," I whispered, barely audible. "They'll see I can stand without them." Ethan reached out his hand. "You already do." I didn't answer. Outside, the church bells began to toll, soft and distant. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and let the sound fill the hollow space where their voices should have been. The morning air smelled like rain and roses. Seattle was still waking up when the first notes from the organ drifted through the church. I stood behind the heavy oak doors, veil trembling slightly with each breath. The coordinator gave me a small nod. "Ready," she whispered. I nodded back, though my heart wasn't sure. The doors opened and every head turned. The light from the stained glass poured down the aisle, soft and golden. And for a moment I almost believed this could still be beautiful. I walked slowly, step by step, bouquet tight in my hands. The white petals brushed against my wrist, leaving faint traces of pollen. Then I saw them. 10 empty seats in the front row. 10 perfect chairs marked reserved. Bennett family, wrapped in ivory ribbons, untouched. My chest tightened. Someone in the third row murmured, "Where's her family?" Another voice whispered, "I thought her father was walking her down." I kept walking, smiling for the cameras, pretending not to hear. Pastor Wilson met my eyes with quiet concern, then gave a small, almost apologetic nod before turning back to his Bible. Ethan stood waiting at the altar, his face steady but strained. When I reached him, he whispered, "You look beautiful." I wanted to say something back, but my throat locked. The choir began to sing soft at first, then rising, filling the silence that hung around those empty seats like fog. Halfway through the song, a faint vibration buzzed against my hip. My phone. I'd forgotten it was tucked in the pocket of my dress. I tried to ignore it. Then it buzzed again, insistent pulsing. The light from the screen shone through the thin fabric, catching the attention of the bridesmaid beside me. Her eyes widened a warning glance. I lowered my bouquet just enough to glance at the screen. Live, Bennett family from Paris. The words hit me like a slap. For a moment I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe a fan account, maybe a repost. I slid the phone slightly from my pocket, shielding it behind the bouquet. The screen came alive. There they were. My father in his gray suit, my mother in gold satin. Sophie laughing under the Eiffel Tower lights. Champagne glasses raised high. My father's voice booming through my tiny speaker. "Cheers to our star." Sophie Bennett. The laughter that followed felt louder than the choir echoing through my head until I could barely hear Pastor Wilson's voice. Around me, people shifted in their seats. Someone in the crowd coughed to fill the awkward quiet. Pastor Wilson hesitated mid-sentence. For a second, even he seemed to lose his place in the ceremony. Then he cleared his throat and went on, his tone a little softer now. Ethan's fingers brushed mine, grounding me. "Hey!" He whispered, barely audible look at me. I looked up, forcing a smile through the sting in my chest. My vows came out in pieces, each word trembling paper thin. "I promise to stand with you." Through everything I managed to say, my bouquet shook. The stems snapped under my grip petals, tearing slightly between my fingers. Ethan squeezed my hand steady, calm. He said his vows, slowly, as if willing me to breathe again. The ceremony felt both endless and too short. Every second dragged through humiliation, and yet blurred past in a haze of whispers and camera flashes. When Pastor Wilson finally pronounced us husband and wife, the choir's voices rose, but I could feel the looks, curiosity, pity, confusion. I walked down the aisle on Ethan's arm, my smile frozen in place, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the sunlight was too bright. Guests crowded around, congratulating us, cameras flashing. My maid of honor leaned in, whispering, "Clara, your family. It's all over social media." I didn't answer. I took my phone from the pocket and saw the numbers glowing, 57 missed calls. Texts from journalists, old classmates, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Notifications from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Someone had tagged me in a post. "When your family chooses fame over family." I scrolled. Photos of them at a rooftop gala in Paris. Sophie standing in front of a logo wall, Maison de Luxe ex Sophie Bennett. The comments burned. The Bennetts are so glamorous. Wait, isn't it their other daughter's wedding day? Ethan came up behind me. "Put the phone away," he said gently. "They're toasting her in Paris," I murmured, staring at the screen. "While I'm standing here smiling for pictures," he touched my arm. "You don't have to smile anymore." But I did. For the guests, for the photos, for the illusion that I was still fine. The photographer called our names, asking us to stand under the archway. "Closer," he said. "Smile." I tilted my chin, just like my mother used to remind me during family portraits. "Smile, Clara, even if it hurts." The flash went off. When the last guest left, the churchyard was quiet, except for the bells tolling in the distance. Ethan stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "You want to go straight to the reception?" I shook my head. No, just a minute. I sat down on the stone steps, lifting my veil to wipe the sweat and tears from my face. The makeup on my palms smeared pink against the white fabric. Ethan sat next to me silent. We didn't need words. The silence said enough. After a while, he said softly, "You still have me." I looked at him, tried to smile, but my voice cracked. I know. I just wish that was enough to make it stop hurting. We sat there until the bells faded. The air smelled like rain again. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the street, the distant sound of laughter from the reception hall we'd never enter. On the bench beside me, my phone buzzed once more. Another headline alert. I turned it face down, unable to look. The light shifted through the clouds, and for a moment the church windows glowed with color. I stared at them, at the way they made even broken glass look beautiful. In the quiet, I heard my own voice in my head, steady, low, certain. The same one that had carried me through years of silence. The day I wore white, they wore gold. The world saw them shining. And me, I was the shadow they left behind. The apartment was too quiet. The flowers from the ceremony were already wilting on the counter, their petals curled in on themselves like they were tired of pretending to be beautiful. I sat on the couch laptop, open, replaying the livestream again. Even though I'd promised myself I wouldn't. My hand trembled on the trackpad. The video was only 43 seconds long, but it felt endless. My father's laughter, my mother's polished smile, Sophie twirling under the lights of Paris, her champagne glass raised as my father's voice carried over the music. To our star. Sophie, Bennett. I muted the sound and watched their faces move without words. It was almost easier that way, like a silent film where I already knew the ending. A drop of water hit the keyboard. For a second, I thought it was a spill, then realized it was just me. I wiped my eyes and pressed pause. My reflection stared back from the black screen. Pale, tired, small. I'd been here before, not this apartment, but this feeling. I was 19 the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible. The memory came so sharp it almost stole my breath. It was 2012. I was standing in the doorway of my father's office holding the letter from the University of Washington. A full scholarship. 4 years. I was shaking with pride, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. "Dad." I said I got in. "They're covering everything." He didn't look up from his computer. "Good. Saves us some money." That was it. No hug, no congratulations. Just numbers and relief. Later that same week, Sophie won a local modeling contest. The house turned into a carnival. Neighbors dropping by, champagne bottles popping, my mother calling relatives across 3 states. A banner reading "Our Star Sophie" hung over the fireplace. I washed dishes while they laughed in the next room, the sink water turning cold around my hands. The memory shifted again. Years earlier this time. I was 12. The floor in the hallway had been slick after Mom's cleaning spree. I'd slipped the crack of bone sharp as thunder. My arm twisted wrong, white-hot pain shooting up to my shoulder. "Mom." I'd gasped. "I think it's broken." She didn't even look up from the phone. "Don't be dramatic, Clara. Ice it." 2 weeks later, Sophie scraped her knee, falling off her bike. Mom screamed for Dad, and they spent the night in the ER. They came home with ice cream and a story about how brave Sophie had been. I stared at the wall until the memory blurred. The clock ticked toward midnight. My laptop screen dimmed. My voice cracked as I whispered to no one I've learned how to endure everything, but never how to be loved. The door opened softly behind me. Ethan's footsteps were slow, careful, as if he didn't want to break whatever spell I was under. "You're still up," he said. Couldn't sleep. He walked closer, stopping behind the couch. Watching it again, I closed the laptop halfway. "Just once more." He hesitated. "Why do you do that to yourself? Because I want to see if it hurts less." I said, "It doesn't." He circled the couch, sat beside me, and took my hand. "They don't deserve to take this day from you." I stared at our intertwined fingers, his skin warm against mine. They already did. They always do. He didn't argue. He just squeezed my hand tighter, and for a moment the silence felt almost safe. "I'm okay," I said after a while, even though we both knew it wasn't true. "Just tired." He nodded, kissed the top of my head, and stood. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." When he disappeared into the bedroom, I opened the laptop again. My social media notifications were impossible to ignore. Hundreds of comments, tags, shares. Strangers analyzing every second of my humiliation. Who does that to their own daughter? Poor thing. She looks so strong, though. Her family should be ashamed. I scrolled until my chest ached. People turned my pain into a headline, my silence into sympathy. It was strange how the world could care when the people who should have never did. I powered off the laptop and sat there in the dark. The city lights outside flickered against the blinds. The hum of traffic mixed with a faint melody from somewhere in the distance, someone's late-night playlist bleeding through the walls. I reached for my phone, opened the music app, and played something soft, slow, something that sounded like the ocean. The first few notes filled the room. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and breathed in the quiet. There were no tears left, just an ache that settled deep under my ribs, familiar and heavy. Through the reflection on the window, I saw my own silhouette. A woman sitting alone in a white dress that already looked out of place. Maybe this was what growing up in my family had always been training me for smiling through the ache, pretending the silence was enough. The song changed a piano piece I used to listen to in college while studying late at night. I remembered that girl. 19, determined, hopeful. She believed hard work would make people stay. I wanted to tell her the truth. Some people only love you when it costs them nothing. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. The flowers on the counter had started to brown at the edges. I pulled one petal off, rolled it between my fingers until it crumbled. From the bedroom, Ethan's breathing had already fallen into rhythm. The hum of the refrigerator filled the empty space his presence left behind. I turned off the light and sat back down on the couch, letting the darkness swallow the room. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed, then faded into the distance. In the stillness, I whispered to myself, "Some wounds don't bleed. They just live quietly inside you until even silence feels like a scar." The city didn't answer. It never did. The next morning, the apartment was dim, the blinds half drawn against the gray Seattle light. The TV hummed softly in the background, the news anchor's voice calm but sharp. The Bennett family faces public criticism after skipping their daughter's wedding to attend Paris Fashion Week with their younger daughter, model Sophie Bennett. My coffee went cold in my hands as footage from the livestream flashed across the screen. My father raising a glass under the Eiffel Tower, lights my mother's golden gown shimmering. Then a clip of me walking alone down the aisle. They even slowed it down for dramatic effect. Ethan grabbed the remote and shut the TV off. "They turned your wedding into a circus." His voice cracked from holding back anger. I stared at the blank screen. "It's fine," I said quietly. "It's not fine." He paced across the room, running his hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have to wake up and see your humiliation on national television." I took a slow sip, even though the coffee tasted bitter. "I'm used to it." He stopped staring at me like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. "That's not something anyone should be used to, Clara." Before I could answer, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number from Oregon. I hesitated, then Ann answered. "Clara," a woman's voice said, rough but steady. "It's Helen." I froze. "Aunt Helen." "It's been a while," she said, exhaling smoke between her words. "I saw the news. I just wanted you to know. I understand more than you think." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "They did the same thing to me," she said. "Your father and Margaret, years ago." I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge. What did they do? Her tone turned bitter, edged with regret. "They used my name to take out a loan for one of your father's early real estate projects. Said it was a family investment. When I found out and refused to sign another, they cut me off. Haven't heard from them since." I closed my eyes. "So they've always been like this." Helen laughed softly. "Worse, maybe. They only love what makes them look good." A silence stretched between us, the kind that says everything words can't. "Listen to me, Clara," she so said finally, her voice low and certain. "Don't let them take anything else from you. You're stronger than I was. You don't owe them forgiveness." "I don't think I ever gave it," I whispered. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." We hung up. The room felt heavier than before, thick with the weight of something old finally being named. I set the phone down and opened my laptop, needing to distract myself with something mechanical. But as soon as the screen lit up, a new email notification popped up from my bank. "Bank alert. Unusual activity detected on your account." I clicked. The subject line blurred as my stomach turned. "Your investment account ending in 4123 has been accessed to authorize a $45,000 transfer as collateral for Maison Sophie Paris. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then I scrolled down looking for a mistake, a wrong name, a misclick anything. But there it was. My name listed as guarantor. I pushed the chair back hard enough that it scraped the floor. Ethan. I called, my voice thin. He came out from the bedroom, still wearing the same shirt from last night. What is it? I turned the laptop toward him. Look, he read, brow furrowing. What the hell? Clara. This says they used your account. I know. My throat tightened. $45,000. That's everything in my portfolio. The savings I built before we even met. Call the bank, he said immediately. Call them right now. I shook my head, already knowing how this would go. They'll say it was authorized. It has my name on it. But you didn't sign anything. I stared at the screen, the digital confirmation glowing like a wound. They must have used a copy of my signature. They've done it before. To Helen. Ethan's jaw clenched. This isn't just betrayal anymore. It's fraud. I let out a short, humorless laugh. In my family, those words are the same thing. He knelt beside me, voice low. We'll fix this, Clara. I'll help you. I didn't look at him. My reflection glared back from the laptop, pale and unblinking. This isn't something you can fix. This is who they are. The coffee cup on the counter tipped slightly as I brushed past it, spilling dark liquid across the marble. I didn't bother wiping it. I stood at the window instead, watching the city waking below. People, walking dogs, buses, passing, the rhythm of normal life continuing without me. Ethan joined me. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about how fast they move, I said quietly. The wedding was just yesterday. They didn't even wait 24 hours. Because they think you won't fight back. He was right. They'd spent a lifetime teaching me to accept it. To smile, stay polite, stay quiet. But something shifted in me then. Something that had been breaking slowly for years. I turned from the window, met his eyes. I'm not letting them do this again. He nodded once. Then let's start with the bank. Tomorrow morning, we'll talk to someone. I shut the laptop and exhaled, my hands still shaking. In the silence that followed, I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of the city outside. My mind kept looping through Helen's voice. You're stronger than I was. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe I wasn't stronger. But I was awake now, and that had to count for something. I picked up the spilled coffee cup, rinsed it under the tap. The water ran brown, swirling down the drain until it cleared. Ethan stood behind me, hand resting lightly on my shoulder. We'll get through this. I turned off the faucet, staring at the empty sink. I used to think their love was cold, I said quietly. But it's not. It's transactional. And I'm the one who keeps paying. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The TV flickered back on by itself, some automatic timer I'd forgotten to disable. The same clip replayed, my parents laughing in Paris, my name in the headline below. This time, I didn't look away. I just stood there watching them toast to everything they thought they'd won. Outside, the first drops of rain hit the window, sliding down the glass in crooked lines. I reached out, traced one with my fingertip, and whispered almost to myself. History repeats itself. Unless you stop it. The rain kept falling. The rain hadn't stopped all morning. It slid down the wide glass windows of Daniel Reed's office, tracing pale streaks against the skyline of downtown Seattle. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap, the smell of coffee and wet paper thick in the air. The desk between us was covered in folders, bank statements, emails, notarized letters, all pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to believe was mine. Daniel adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers with quick, practiced precision. He paused on one document, frowned, and held it up so I could see. This, he said, tapping the bottom corner, isn't your signature. I leaned forward. The loops and lines looked close. Too close. But they weren't mine. The C in Clara was too sharp, the slant too aggressive. It felt foreign, like an imitation of me, written by someone who thought they knew me better than I knew myself. They forged it, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. This is a clear violation under Washington state law. Identity fraud and unauthorized use of investment assets. We can file immediately, but we'll need confirmation from your bank and a handwriting analyst. Ethan sat beside me, restless, his leg bouncing under the table. Then let's file, he said. What are we waiting for? Daniel looked at him evenly. Evidence. Once we make this formal, it becomes public record. There's no going back. Are you ready for that? Clara? I stared at the contract. The line with my forged signature seemed to mock me, its confidence louder than truth. They used my name, I said. They took everything I earned and gave it to Sophie's brand, to make her look legitimate. Ethan placed his hand on mine. Then we stopped them. Daniel slid a form across the desk. Here's the complaint draft. I'll request full transaction history from the bank. We'll start the forensic review today. I signed my real name at the bottom pen, trembling slightly. Do you think they even hesitated? Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced out at the rain before saying no. They thought you'd stay silent. People like that always do. When we left the building, the rain was heavier. Ethan pulled up the hood of his jacket, trying to shield me, but I let the water hit my face. It felt cleansing in a way nothing else had in days. He opened the car door for me. You did the right thing. I don't feel like it. I said, climbing in. It feels like I just declared war on my own family. He turned the key. Sometimes war is the only way to end a long silence. The wipers scraped back and forth as we drove through the soaked streets. I watched the city blur by. The people hurrying under umbrellas, the coffee shops glowing warm in the gray morning. Everything moving like life hadn't paused for anyone. Back at the apartment, I peeled off my wet coat and walked straight to the bookshelf where an old photo album sat. The leather cover was cracked from years of being handled and ignored. I hadn't opened it since before the wedding. I flipped through the pages. There we were. Christmas dinners, birthdays, vacations. But no picture ever had all four of us smiling at once. Either my father looked distracted, my mother posed too perfectly, or I wasn't in the frame at all. Then there was one that stopped me. Sophie, at 19, standing on a red carpet, my parents glowing beside her. She was radiant. Hairstyle, designer dress, that effortless confidence I never learned to fake. The caption in my mother's handwriting read, "Our star shining bright." I touched the corner of the photo, smudging it slightly. My voice was barely a whisper. I was always the shadow behind them. Ethan came up behind me, his reflection appearing beside mine in the glass of the window. "You don't have to keep looking," he said softly. I said, "I need to remember exactly who they are." The phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Daniel. Filed the report. Bank and state investigators notified. They'll have to respond within 10 business days. I exhaled. 10 days. 10 days until the people who raised me would have to sit across from lawyers and justify stealing from their own daughter. Ethan took the phone from my hand and read it. "It's happening," he said. "Yeah." My voice was steady, but something inside me felt like breaking. He turned me toward him, cupping my face gently. "You're not alone in this. I know," I said, "but I need to be the one who stands up to them." Rain hammered harder against the windows, blurring the skyline completely now. I watched the gray sheet of water slide down, turning the city into a watercolor of lights and motion. The sound reminded me of the night my father taught me how to read financial statements, how to understand numbers like a man, as he used to say. I was 15, sitting at the dining table, trying to impress him. He'd smiled then, proud, for one fleeting moment. That was the only time I remember feeling seen. Now those same numbers, the accounts, the balances, the signatures, had become the weapon he used against me. Later that afternoon, the apartment grew quiet again. I sat by the window, laptop open to a spreadsheet Daniel had sent, evidence columns, transaction IDs. I stared at the line item marked Transfer Maison Sophie Paris, collateral, and felt the last thread of denial snap. When evening came, I printed the forms Daniel had emailed and signed each one, my real name, in my real handwriting. Every stroke felt like reclaiming something they had taken. Ethan came over holding a mug of tea. "You ready to send these back?" "Almost," I said, scanning one last page. "This makes it official, right?" He nodded. "They'll get the notice by tomorrow morning." I placed the papers into the envelope and sealed it. The sound of the adhesive closing was strangely final. We walked out to the mailbox together. The rain had turned into a drizzle, faint enough that the streetlights reflected off the puddles like mirrors. I slipped the envelope through the slot and stood there for a moment staring after it. Ethan slid his arm around me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. For the first time in years, maybe I am. He smiled, small but genuine. "Then let's go home." But I didn't move. I looked up at the tall glass tower across the street. The bank's building, its logo glowing through the mist. My reflection shimmered faintly in the wet glass. Voice steady, I said to no one in particular, I waited for them to walk me down the aisle. Now they can walk into court. Ethan squeezed my hand and we stood there in the rain until the cold finally pushed us back inside. The city lights blinked against the dark sky, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small underneath them. The headlines hit before noon. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, lighting up with every notification, every new headline that twisted my life into a headline-worthy disaster. Seattle financial consultant sues. Her parents for fraud, family feud. Turns legal in the Bennett household, from wedding scandal to courtroom drama. Clara Bennett strikes back. By lunch, the gossip blogs had joined in. One of them ran a photo of Ethan and me outside Daniel's office, the headline in bold letters. Ethan Miller, the husband who married into money, or tried to. I threw the phone onto the couch. Ethan was at work, so the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The silence felt heavy like a pause before another blow. When my phone rang again, I almost didn't answer. But the caller ID said Ethan, and my chest loosened just a little. "Hey," I said. "He didn't waste time. They're talking about me." His voice was low controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Some blogger called me a gold digger. Said I used you to climb into a better tax bracket." I pressed my fingers to my temple. "It's garbage, Ethan. You know that. I know it, but they don't," he snapped. "People at work are whispering. I heard my boss say he never pegged me for that type." I closed my eyes, picturing him standing in his office, surrounded by coworkers, pretending not to stare. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." He sighed a shaky exhale that carried exhaustion. "I hate that they're dragging me into this. This isn't my fight." "It's not," I said softly. "It's mine." "But you got caught in the crossfire." There was a long pause on the line. Then his voice softened. "I just need to hear you say you believe me." "I do," I said immediately. "Always." He didn't answer for a moment, then murmured, "That's all I needed," and hung up. I sat there staring at the dark TV screen, my reflection faint against the glass. For the first time I wondered if I'd asked too much of him, if loving me meant living under the fallout of my family's chaos. When he came home that night, neither of us said much. He set down his bag, kissed my forehead, and started making dinner like nothing was wrong. The clatter of pans and the hiss of oil filled the silence between us. We ate quietly, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace but fatigue. I pushed food around my plate without tasting it. Ethan finished half his meal, then looked up at me. "You haven't eaten a thing." "I'm just not hungry." "You've got to keep your strength up." For what I asked, not to be cruel, but because I truly didn't know what came next. He stared at me, then set his fork down. "For you. For us." The TV flickered to life on its own. An autoplay news recap from earlier. My name filled the screen, followed by my parents' photos, and then Ethan's. The anchor's voice was calm and detached. "The Bennetts have yet to issue a statement, but sources close to the family describe the lawsuit as a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Ethan Miller, Clara's husband, faces online scrutiny over his financial ties to the case." Ethan reached for the remote, but I beat him to it, shutting the TV off. "We can't keep running from it," I said. "I'm not running," he said, "but I won't let them define who we are." I looked at him across the table. The man who'd held my hand in front of an empty church, who'd said his vows when the whole world turned to watch my humiliation. "You think we can outrun their version of us?" He smiled faintly. "I don't need to outrun them. I just need to stand next to you." The next morning he kept his word. I woke up to my phone buzzing again, but this time it wasn't bad news. Ethan had posted a photo from our wedding, the one where I was laughing before I saw the empty seats. His caption read, "I'm proud of the strongest woman I know. The world will remember her name for the right reasons." The post spread fast. Thousands of likes, comments, messages of support from women across the country. "You're both brave. Stay strong. Justice is coming." For the first time in days, I felt something shift, a small, defiant warmth where the shame used to live. Ethan texted me an hour later. "Might have poked the bear, but I don't care." I smiled at the screen, typing back. "They can't twist what's already true." Later that evening, when he came home, the air felt lighter. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean. We ate takeout on the balcony overlooking the damp skyline. The streetlights reflected on the slick pavement below like small fires. Ethan leaned on the railing beside me, the steam from his coffee fogging the air between us. "You see the comments today?" "Yeah," I said. "For once they were kind." He smiled. "The internet has a soul, after all." We both laughed quietly, the sound unfamiliar, but welcome. I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder. The city was alive beneath us. Cars moving people, walking the soft hum of something larger than both of us. I thought I'd lost everything I said finally. My name, my family, my peace. But maybe this is what I get instead. What's that, he asked. Someone who doesn't walk away when everyone else does. He slipped an arm around me, pulling me closer. Then we're even, he said. You didn't walk away from me either. The air grew colder, a gentle wind brushing my hair across my face. I reached for my cup of tea, letting the warmth settle into my palms. Ethan took the blanket draped over the chair and wrapped it around my shoulders. We stood there in silence, the city glowing beneath us, the weight of everything slowly lifting. Through the glass doors, the reflection of our faces blurred against the skyline as two figures holding steady while the world kept spinning. The night was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic and the whisper of the wind. For the first time since the wedding, I felt the calm of something unbroken. The storm had left its cracks, yes, but in the dim light of Seattle, I realized that not all fractures mean failure. Some are just proof that we survived. The wind coming off Elliott Bay was sharp enough to sting. I stood outside Pier 57 watching the waves slap against the docks, my reflection trembling in the water below. The restaurant lights glimmered against the glass like a stage I didn't want to walk onto. My phone buzzed again, Mom's voice message playing for the 5th time that day. Your father wants to talk, Clara. Just dinner. Tonight, 7 o'clock. It wasn't really a request. It never was. I'd called Daniel that afternoon, my voice calm but flat. They want to meet, I'd said. He hesitated. You should go, he said finally. But record everything. Don't let them turn the story around. Now standing outside the restaurant, I could still hear his words echoing in my head. I glanced back at Ethan, waiting a few steps behind me. His collar turned up against the wind. He caught my eye. I'll sit close, he said. If it goes bad, I'll step in. It'll go bad, I replied quietly. It always does. The hostess greeted me by name. Apparently, my mother had reserved the family table. I followed her past a wall of glass, the bay stretching wide and dark beyond. The restaurant was crowded, but my parents had found the one corner where the lighting made everything look expensive. Robert Bennett was already seated, posture perfect, wearing the same dark suit I remembered from every event that wasn't about me. My mother, Margaret, smiled, that polished smile she saved for the press, the kind that never reached her eyes. Sophie sat between them, scrolling through her phone, her nails tapping rhythmically on the screen. Clara, my father said as I approached. His voice was low, rehearsed. You look... well, I'm fine, I said, sliding into the seat across from them. Let's get to the point. He cleared his throat, taking a sip of wine. Sophie's situation has become difficult. After the Paris coverage and the investigation, well, it's been devastating for her career. Sophie scoffed. You mean your reputation? He shot her a look. This family is tied together, Sophie. We all sink or swim together. Then to me, we're under enormous pressure. The business is struggling. Your mother and I have decided it would be best if we handled this privately, without further legal escalation. Privately, I repeated. You mean quietly? My mother's tone softened, practiced empathy slipping in like perfume. Honey, this isn't about blame. It's about finding peace. I stared at her, the candlelight flickering between us. You used my name, my accounts, my signature, and now you want peace. Sophie crossed her arms. Oh, please. You act like you're the victim, but you've been cashing in on the drama for months. The interviews, the sympathy. Don't pretend you're not enjoying it. I laughed softly, almost pitying her. I'd trade every headline for one honest apology. My father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Enough. We didn't come here to rehash the past. We need a solution. You can afford to help. 45,000 is nothing to you now. My fingers tightened around my water glass. You want me to cover your debt? To protect the family name, he said simply. The same name you dragged through the mud. I replied. My mother reached across the table. If you do this, everything can go back to normal. Normal for who I asked. You. The woman who taught me silence is more valuable than truth. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then Sophie slammed her phone down, the sound sharp enough to make people turn. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me fail, watching them beg. You've always wanted to be the center of attention. I looked at her calm and tired. No, Sophie, I just wanted to be seen. The words hung there heavier than the music playing in the background. My father exhaled hard, his patience thinning. You ungrateful child. Everything you have, your education, your career, your success, was built on my foundation. Without me, you'd have nothing. I reached for my purse and pulled out an envelope, placing it gently in front of him. You're wrong, Dad. I built everything in spite of you. He frowned. What is this? The investigation report, I said. The one with your forged signature on the withdrawal authorization. He froze. My mother's face drained of color. Sophie looked between them, confused. You had your chance to explain. I continued. But now you'll explain it to a judge. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the glass stem. You'd really do this? To your own family, I didn't start this. I said, I'm just finishing it. For a moment, nobody spoke. The clinking of glasses from nearby tables filled the air. Then Sophie stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. I'm done, she said, eyes glossy with anger. You're all insane! She stormed off toward the exit, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. My mother whispered, Robert, say something. But he didn't. He just sat there staring at the envelope like it was something radioactive. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. You'll regret this. Maybe I said standing. But at least it'll be my choice. Behind me, I felt Ethan's presence before I saw him. He touched my shoulder, his voice low but steady. Ready. I nodded. We walked toward the exit. The air behind us thick with silence. As the door closed, I glanced once over my shoulder. My father had slumped in his chair, his face pale, and drawn his hand still on the untouched wineglass. Outside, the wind off the bay hit me again, cold and briny. The sound of the harbor mixed with the city lights, a strange kind of peace. Ethan slipped his hand into mine, his grip firm grounding. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I said quietly, watching the water ripple under the pier lights. For the first time, I think I am. He smiled faintly. Then let's go home. As we walked away, I caught a glimpse of the restaurant's reflection in the bay, the candlelight flickering through the windows, like ghosts of a family that no longer existed. I didn't look back again. The first time I saw my parents' faces on national television, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing at all, just the dull, heavy quiet that comes when the world finally says out loud what you've known your whole life. The segment opened with a title card, Hadje Paris Family. Live, when fame kills morality. The familiar voice of the evening focus anchor filled the room as the screen flashed between clips of the livestream from Paris and the video of my wedding. My father's champagne glass, raised high against the Eiffel Tower, dissolved into the image of me standing alone in the aisle. The anchor's tone was calm, deliberate. While the bride waited at the altar, her parents toasted her sister's modeling debut in Paris. What began as a family scandal has now evolved into a financial investigation. I turned down the volume, but the captions kept rolling across the bottom of the screen. Footage of Sophie smiling for cameras. The words, Maison. Sophie Paris, closed, stamped across the image in red. They cut to a street interview, an older woman shaking her head saying, No one deserves to be humiliated like that. Not by family. Another clip showed a man outside a cafe. They thought money could erase empathy. Guess not. Ethan muted the TV completely, his reflection pale against the window. You shouldn't watch this, he said. I already lived it, I said quietly. They're just replaying it for the world. My phone vibrated on the counter, Daniel's name flashing on the screen. I answered. They're opening a formal investigation, he said. Washington State Securities Commission. Fraud, unauthorized use of assets. It's moving fast. I sat down, my hand tightening around the phone. Do they have to testify? Yes. They'll both be called in for statements. And Clara, he hesitated. The damages now exceed 45,000, closer to 60. The number didn't shock me anymore. It was just another measure of distance between who they were and who I thought they could be. Thank you, Daniel. He exhaled. You did the right thing. When I hung up, the silence in the apartment felt thick again. Ethan poured 2 glasses of water, sliding one toward me. So what happens now? They'll have to face what they did, I said, staring at the condensation on the glass. For once, they can't talk their way out of it, he nodded, then paused. We could leave, go somewhere quiet. No reporters, no social media, no one asking questions. Disappear. I asked, half smiling. That's their way, not mine. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You've been fighting this alone for months. You don't owe anyone more explanations. I looked out the window, watching the city blur beneath a soft drizzle. Silence is what made me small. I won't give it to them again. He didn't argue. He knew I'd already decided. That night, the story spread faster than anything I could have imagined. My name was trending on Twitter again. This time not as the daughter left behind, but as the whistleblower. Screenshots of the broadcast flooded every feed. Sophie's company account vanished within hours. News outlets reported that French investors had withdrawn their funding, citing ethical concerns. By morning, the Portland Business Journal published a single, merciless line: Robert Bennett has been removed from the Pacific Northwest Business Council pending investigation. I stared at the headline over breakfast, my spoon suspended midair. Ethan sat across from me, reading on his phone. They're losing everything he said. I set the newspaper down. They lost it long before this. They just didn't notice. He reached across the table, taking my hand. This doesn't have to define you. I know, I said, but it defines them. And maybe that's enough. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. You're stronger than they ever imagined. I wanted to believe that, but strength felt like an overused word, something people said when they couldn't think of anything else. What I felt wasn't strength. It was resolve, cold and quiet. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk along the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and rain. The ferries drifted in the distance, their horns echoing through the bay. I thought of the dinner at Pier 57, of my father's hand gripping his wineglass, his eyes full of fear for the first time in my life. I hadn't planned revenge. I hadn't even planned justice. I'd just told the truth, and the world had done the rest. When I returned home, Ethan was in the kitchen scrolling through his phone. You should see this, he said, turning the screen toward me. It was a clip from the same news station this time, with a new headline: Public Support for Clara Bennett Grows. The anchor read viewer comments out loud. She stood up for herself when no one else would. A quiet revolution in heels. Finally, a story where the villain loses without the hero getting dirty. I laughed under my breath. A revolution in heels. They make it sound like a campaign. Ethan smiled. Maybe it is. That night, I lay awake while he slept beside me. The city outside pulsed faintly, lights flickering, sirens in the distance, the hum of traffic never fully resting. I opened my laptop, scrolled through unread emails. Among them was one from a name I didn't recognize at first. Rachel Nguyen, Women in Finance Network. Her message was short. We'd love to have you share your story, how you rebuilt after betrayal. Millions of women would relate. Are you open to an interview? I stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen illuminating the quiet apartment. Ethan stirred, half asleep. What is it? An interview, I whispered. A chance to say something that matters. He mumbled, You already have. I smiled faintly, closing the laptop. Not yet. When I turned off the light, the room sank into darkness, but the reflection from the city still shimmered against the window. My own face appeared faintly in the glass, tired, calm, and unafraid. For the first time, I wasn't defined by what they'd taken from me. I was defined by what I refused to give back. The studio lights were brighter than I expected, sharp, almost surgical. I could feel the heat on my skin, the faint hum of the cameras, as the crew moved in silence around me. Rachel Nguyen sat across from me, calm, composed, her voice, the kind that could make even the hardest questions sound kind. The audience behind the glass wall waited quietly, faces half lit by the glow of the set. Ready? She asked softly. I nodded, though my palms were damp. I had spent months defending myself to lawyers and headlines. But this felt different. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about truth. The floor manager counted down with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. Rachel smiled into the camera. Good morning. Our guest today is Clara Bennett, financial consultant advocate for ethical finance, and the woman whose story sparked a national conversation about family trust and accountability. I exhaled quietly, smiling just enough to hide the tremor in my breath. Rachel turned to me. Clara, thank you for joining us. I want to start with the question everyone's been asking. She leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but direct. Do you regret suing your own parents? There it was, the question people whispered but never asked to my face. I took a breath. No. I said, I didn't sue them to punish them. I did it to stop them from doing the same thing again. To me, to anyone. She nodded slowly. That must have been an incredibly difficult decision. It was, I said, but sometimes the hardest thing you can do for someone you love is hold them accountable. The audience was silent. The cameras caught every movement, every flicker of expression. Rachel continued, and the case is officially closed now. Yes, I said, the corners of my lips softening. The settlement was finalized last week. I didn't get the money back, but I got something better. She tilted her head. And what's that? My name, I said, and the right to own it. Behind us, the giant LED screen flickered to life. White letters across a black background, case closed. Settlement granted. The words looked surreal, too simple to contain the years behind them. Rachel turned slightly toward the camera again. For those watching, this case has become a landmark example of financial abuse within families, a subject often hidden behind closed doors. Then she turned back to me. How are your parents now? Clara, have you spoken to them? I hesitated. The lights felt hotter suddenly. They've lost a lot, I said carefully. Their reputation, their company connections. But maybe that's what they needed, to understand what loss feels like. Do you think they've learned anything from this? I looked down at my hands resting on my lap. I don't know. Maybe someday they'll see that love isn't ownership. It's responsibility. The room was still for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. Then Rachel smiled softly. That's powerful. I glanced toward the audience. In the front row, Ethan sat with his hands clasped, eyes bright. He gave me a small nod, the same one he gave me at the altar at the courthouse, in every room where I thought I couldn't breathe. Rachel continued, her voice steady. Clara, what would you say to others, especially women, who find themselves betrayed by the people they trust most? I swallowed. The question landed deep. I'd tell them it's okay to walk away, I said slowly. Even from the people who raised you. You can love them and still protect yourself. Forgiveness doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's just choosing peace over pain. Someone in the audience sniffled quietly. Rachel smiled again, closing her notebook. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for reminding us that strength doesn't always come from fighting louder, but from standing still. The applause started softly, then grew louder until it filled the studio. Rachel reached across the table, squeezing my hand briefly. The cameras zoomed out, capturing the full set as the outro music began to play. When the red light turned off, the world shifted back to normal volume. The hum of equipment, the shuffle of crew members, the faint buzz of the air vents overhead. Rachel leaned toward me, her voice low so only I could hear. You know thousands of women will see themselves in your story today. You gave them a language for what they've been living. I smiled faintly, still catching my breath. I just told the truth. Exactly, she said. And that's what makes it powerful. A stagehand motioned for us to clear the set. I stood, smoothing my jacket, the adrenaline still humming in my veins. Ethan met me halfway, wrapping his arms around me without saying anything. The lights from the ceiling glinted off the tears in his eyes before he blinked them away. Proud of you, he whispered. I know. I said softly, resting my forehead against his shoulder. I felt it. As we left the studio, the hallway outside buzzed with phones and conversation. Someone from the production team ran up holding a tablet. It's already trending, she said breathlessly. 500,000 views in 20 minutes. Ethan laughed under his breath. Guess we're not disappearing after all. I looked at the screen, my face frozen mid-laugh, the caption beneath it reading, Forgiveness is freedom. Outside, the San Francisco sun was just starting to rise, spilling light through the fog. We stepped onto the sidewalk, the city stretching awake around us. I stopped for a moment, feeling the air, the sound, the pulse of everything alive and ordinary. For so long, my story had been about surviving. Now, it finally felt like living. As we walked toward the car, Ethan slipped his hand into mine. What now? He asked. I smiled, watching the sunlight shimmer against the glass towers above. Now, I said, we start again. And for once, those words didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like the truth. The sun had begun to dip low over the marina when the first guests arrived. The light spilled through the tall windows of our new apartment, turning everything golden. The wooden table, the glassware, even the framed photo from the wedding I'd almost forgotten to unpack. It wasn't a big dinner, just 4 people who'd stayed when the world got too loud. Ethan, Karen, Derek, and Aunt Helen. But for the first time, that felt like enough. Karen was the first to step inside, balancing a bouquet of lilies and a bottle of wine. "Don't tell me you actually cooked," she teased, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I followed a recipe," I said. "Mostly." Derek came in right behind her, carrying a pie box like it was gold. "If it's a disaster, at least dessert's covered," he said, grinning. Helen was slower, leaning on her cane, wrapped in a gray shawl that looked like it had seen every decade of her life. When I kissed her cheek, she whispered, "You look peaceful, Clara. It suits you. Stay," I said. "There's plenty of room." The apartment filled quickly with the kind of noise I'd missed, the sound of plates clinking, wine being poured, laughter bouncing off the walls. Ethan moved around easily, refilling glasses, adjusting candles, touching my shoulder as he passed like a quiet reminder that I wasn't doing this alone. By the time we sat down, the sky outside had deepened to a watercolor of rose and blue. The city buzzed below, distant but alive. Derek raised his fork before the first bite, so he said, leaning back, "How does it feel being the face of national redemption? I saw you on CNN's front page yesterday." Karen groaned. "Don't start." "No, let him," I said, smiling. "It feels strange, like watching someone else's life play on TV and realizing it's yours." "Well," Derek said, grinning, "it's working. My inbox is flooded." "Do you know her? Can she handle new clients?" "I told them you're booked until 2026. Laughter rippled around the table. Karen lifted her glass. To Clara Bennett, she said warmly, "The woman who did what most of us are too scared to do, look blood in the eye and tell it no." I felt my throat tighten, but I raised my glass. To moving forward, I said, "Even when you have to drag your heart with you." Helen's voice came next, low and steady. "You ended the cycle, child. Our family's been spinning in the same silence for generations, hurt denial pretending it's all fine. You stopped it. You did what I couldn't." Her words hit something deep. I looked at her across the table, her eyes soft but proud. "You did the hard part," I said. "You survived long enough for me to see how." The moment lingered warm and quiet. Then Derek, sensing the shift, clapped his hands together. "All right, someone pass me the potatoes before this turns into a therapy session." We laughed again. It felt good, easy, not forced. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. I ignored it at first, but the notification banner caught my eye. San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. "Congratulations." I stood, wiped my hands, and opened the email. "Dear Ms. Bennett," it began. "We're pleased to inform you that Bennett Financial Consulting has been recertified as a 2025 Transparency and Ethics Business of the Year." I read it twice before turning back to the table. "Looks like we're official again," I said. Ethan looked up from his plate, smiling. "See, told you the world catches up to the truth eventually." Karen raised her glass again. "And to a company that didn't need to buy its reputation, it earned it." Helen chuckled. "The way it should be." I sat down, the weight of it all sinking in. Not pride exactly, but something calmer. Validation, maybe. The quiet kind that doesn't need applause. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You stood up, Clara. You didn't wait for anyone to pull you out." I looked at him, the candlelight flickering between us. I guess I learned that rescue and redemption don't always come from the same place. He smiled, reaching for my hand. "And you don't owe either of them to anyone." The evening stretched into stories and small confessions. Karen told a ridiculous tale about her first corporate job. Derek imitated their old boss until everyone was in tears laughing. Helen sat quietly for most of it, watching her hands folded neatly on the table. When the laughter died down, she spoke again. "You know, Clara, I used to think family was about loyalty. Now I think it's about choice. You chose who stayed." I nodded, her words sinking deep. "I think so too." Outside, the lights along the bay shimmered. The air smelled faintly of salt and city that mix only San Francisco seemed to master. For once, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone to see what the world was saying. This moment, these people, were enough. As the night wound down, Ethan grabbed the camera and waved everyone to the couch. "One photo," he said. "Come on, this one's going in the new office. We crowded together, Karen making a face, Derek raising his glass mid-laugh, Helen smiling the kind of smile that only comes from peace. I leaned into Ethan, his arm firm around my shoulders. The flash went off. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The golden light, the warmth, the soft hum of music in the background. And then the laughter started again, spilling into the room like music. I glanced at the photo on the camera screen. A blur of joy and motion, imperfect and real. For the first time in years, I didn't think about what was missing. I thought about who had stayed. And as the last of the sunlight faded through the window, I realized that this right here was what healing actually looked like. The letter came on a quiet morning in March, wrapped in a plain white envelope, with handwriting I hadn't seen in years. The return address read Portland, Oregon. No company name, no business logo, just R. Bennett. For a moment, I thought about not opening it. The paper felt heavy in my hand, the weight of something unfinished. Ethan was making coffee in the kitchen when he noticed me standing by the window, still holding it. "Who's it from?" he asked, though he already knew. "My father," I said. He hesitated. "Do you want me to—" "I'll read it." The seal broke easily. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. His handwriting was uneven, like each word had cost him effort. "Clara, I've lost everything. The house, the company, the friends who used to call. I thought those things made me who I was. But maybe for the first time I see it clearly. Success never made anyone worth loving. I can't fix what I broke, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I understand now. I hope you're well. Take care of yourself. Dad." I stood there for a long time, the words blurring in the morning light. Ethan set the mug down beside me. "What does it say?" I handed him the paper. He read it quietly, then looked up. "He's trying," maybe I said, or maybe he's just finally out of people left to talk to. Ethan reached for my hand. "Will you write him back?" I shook my head. "No. I think that letter was his way of saying goodbye. I don't need to add anything to it." He studied my face, searching for something he didn't find. "You're not angry?" I looked out the window. The city was bright, the early spring sunlight washing everything in a pale gold. I was angry for so long. Now I just don't feel the need to carry it anymore. He nodded slowly. "Peace looks good on you." That afternoon I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into my bag. There was somewhere I needed to go. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the bay, quiet, except for the wind rustling through the cypress trees. The air smelled faintly of salt and cut grass. Helen had been gone 2 months now. Her headstone was simple. Helen Carter, 1959 to 2025. She kept the light on. I knelt beside it, brushing away a few stray petals from the flowers Ethan and I had left last week. From my bag, I pulled the letter and placed it against the stone. "You told me to stop waiting for them," I said softly. "I think I finally did." The paper fluttered in the wind, the corner catching on the edge of the marble. I pressed it flat with my palm. "I don't know if he means what he wrote," I continued, "but I guess that's not my responsibility anymore." A bird landed on a nearby branch, its song breaking the stillness. The sound was light, almost too gentle for the weight of the moment. I sat there for a while, watching the clouds drift lazily across the blue. The breeze lifted strands of hair across my face. I could feel the earth beneath my knees, cool and solid, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't need an apology," I whispered. "I just need to know I don't need it anymore." A small sound drew my attention. A child, no more than 6, walking between the graves, with a bouquet of daisies too big for her arms. She stopped at a headstone a few feet away and carefully laid the flowers down, patting them into place the way a child might straighten a blanket. Her mother waited nearby, smiling gently. "Good job, sweetheart." The girl turned, caught my eye, and grinned shyly before skipping back to her mother. I watched them leave the simple grace of that small act, tugging something deep inside me. When I was her age, I used to dream of moments like that. Someone guiding me, showing me how to care, how to let go. Instead, I learned to build my own rituals, to comfort myself with the idea that someday silence could mean safety. I reached out and traced the letters on Helen's stone. "You'd laugh at me for getting sentimental," I said. "But you'd also tell me it's about time." The sun had moved lower now, shadows stretching long across the grass. I stood, brushed the dirt from my knees, and looked once more at the letter. The wind caught it, rustling it softly, and I let it stay where it was. As I walked back toward the gate, the city skyline came into view beyond the hill, small, almost fragile from this distance. I thought about the man in Portland who had written to me, sitting alone with his regrets. and for the first time I didn't feel bound to him anymore. Halfway down the path, Ethan was waiting in the car, leaning against the door hands in his pockets. When he saw me, he straightened and opened the passenger side. "How was it?" he asked. "Quiet," I said. "Peaceful." He nodded, starting the engine. "You left the letter, yes." He glanced at me. "You sure that's what you wanted?" I looked out the window as we pulled away, the wind tugging at the cherry blossoms lining the road. "It's exactly what I wanted," I said. He sent me his last word. I left mine. Neither of us spoke after that. The drive home was filled with the steady rhythm of the tires against the asphalt and the faint hum of the radio. As we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, the sky turned a soft orange, the sunlight spilling over the bay like it was washing everything clean. I rested my head against the glass and closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I could still see the little girl with the daisies, the way her small hands had held something fragile, and made it beautiful simply by caring for it. Maybe that was love, I thought. Not the kind that demands or explains, but the kind that just shows up quietly with flowers and patience long after the noise has faded. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the ocean through the half-open window, and in that small, fleeting moment, I felt it again. The kind of peace that doesn't need forgiveness to exist. The lights inside the Grand Hyatt Conference Hall were warm and golden, spilling softly across the rows of chairs that filled the room. The backdrop read, "Women in Leadership 2025, and somewhere behind it I could hear the low murmur of hundreds of voices blending together like ocean waves before a storm. My name appeared on the screen. Clara Bennett, founder. Bennett Financial Consulting. The applause began before I even reached the podium. I smiled politely, gripping the edges of the lectern as the room settled into silence. The spotlights were bright but gentle, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like they were burning holes through me. I took a breath. "Thank you," I began. My voice echoed slightly steady but soft. When they asked me to speak today about leadership, I hesitated. I didn't think of myself as one. I thought leaders were the people who never fell apart, the ones who never lost control. I paused, scanning the audience. Rows of women in blazers, students with notebooks open, journalists with cameras poised. But then I realized leadership is just standing up when the people who raised you taught you to kneel. A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the crowd. I saw heads nodding. Someone in the front wiped a tear. I clicked to the next slide. Behind me, the screen glowed with a simple phrase, "Justice through grace, justice." I said, "Isn't always about someone losing. Sometimes it's just about someone else finally choosing to walk away." Images shifted behind me. Unplanned, raw memories embedded into my story. The empty chairs from my wedding. My parents' champagne glasses raised in Paris. The envelope I left on that table at Pier 57. Ethan's face when I said my vows, when I almost couldn't finish them. I used to think revenge was about balance. I continued that if someone hurt you, the only way to make it right was to hurt them back. But the truth is revenge doesn't heal you. It just keeps you tied to the wound. Justice, the kind that lasts, comes quietly, through grace, through release. The words came easier than I expected, like they'd been waiting years to leave my chest. I looked at the audience, at the young woman in the second row, clinging to every word, at the older woman in the back, holding her heart. "You don't owe forgiveness to the people who broke you," I said. "You owe peace to the person you're becoming." For a long moment, the room was silent. No phones, no typing, just breath. Then Rachel Nguyen, sitting near the stage, gave a small nod. The applause started slow, and then rose like a tide until the hall was filled with it. People stood clapping, some crying, some smiling through tears. I bowed my head, humbled, letting the sound wash over me. It wasn't noise, it was understanding. When the lights dimmed and the music faded, I stepped off the stage. Ethan was waiting in the wings, his eyes shining. "You did it," he said. "I didn't do anything." I whispered, still catching my breath. "I just told the truth again." He smiled, wrapping an arm around me as we walked through the side corridor toward the lobby. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and perfume, and for once my heartbeat felt steady. Outside the conference room, a few reporters lingered. One of them, a young woman with a press badge, stepped forward, hesitant. "Ms. Bennett," she said, recorder in hand. "Just one question. Do you still talk to your family?" The question didn't sting. Not anymore. I smiled, calm and unshaken. "No," I said simply. but I wish them peace." She nodded, almost relieved, and stepped back as the elevator doors opened. We rode down to the lobby together. The doors slid open to the sound of the city settling into evening. Traffic low, the faint call of a street musician somewhere outside. I followed the music to the balcony that overlooked the bay. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and pink, the kind of color that looks like forgiveness. I leaned against the railing, feeling the cool air tug at my hair. The water below shimmered like liquid glass, the sun melting slowly into the horizon. Behind me, I could hear the soft murmur of people leaving the hall laughter and footsteps fading into distance. I thought about everything. The wedding, the betrayal, the silence that followed. The long nights of waiting for a call that never came. The courtroom papers, the headlines, the noise. And then I thought of the little girl with the daisies in the cemetery, her tiny hands placing flowers where love used to live. That was what healing felt like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was steady, quiet, honest. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of waves hitting the pier. Ethan joined me, slipping his jacket over my shoulders. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. For a moment, I looked back at the conference banner through the glass doors, those 3 words glowing faintly in the dusk, justice through grace. I turned back toward the water and smiled. "They used to livestream their lives," I said softly, almost to myself, "to show the world what they had." Ethan looked at me, eyes gentle. "And what do you have now?" I met his gaze, peace, and the freedom to be seen for who I really am. He nodded, pulling me closer. As the last light of day touched the water, I closed my eyes. The noise, the pain, the years of trying to prove my worth. They were gone now, replaced by something lighter. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was nearly gone, leaving behind a sky filled with color and promise. The bay glowed beneath it, calm and endless. My voice, soft but sure, rose over the wind. They once streamed their lives to show the world what they owned. I just want the world to see who I've become. I stood there until the last edge of sunlight disappeared behind the bridge, until the sky gave itself fully to night. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like someone who had survived something. I felt like someone who had arrived. Have you ever watched your family celebrate someone else while you stood alone? Tell me your story.